There is a moment, a single, quiet moment, that history almost forgot. It happened somewhere over the English Channel in the autumn of 1940. A German intelligence officer, fresh from a meeting with the Reich's most powerful commanders, placed a reconnaissance photograph on a table. The photograph showed a factory, an American factory, half built, sitting on flat, empty land somewhere in the American Midwest. Nothing around it but fields and sky. The officer waited, and then Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe, the most decorated air commander in the Third Reich, the man who had personally crushed the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Hermann Göring looked at that photograph, looked at the intelligence report sitting beside it, and he laughed. He actually laughed. Because the Americans, he had just been told, had announced a plan, a staggering, absurd, delusional plan. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had stood before Congress and declared that the United States of America would build 50,000 military aircraft. Not in a decade, not over the course of the entire war, 50,000 planes per year. Göring laughed because to him it was a joke, a fantasy dreamed up by politicians who had never felt the heat of a burning city, never watched a Stuka dive through clouds, never commanded a real air force. America didn't have the factories. America didn't have the workers. America didn't have the engineering tradition, the industrial discipline, the national will. America was soft. America was slow. America was asleep. He was so certain. He was so catastrophically, historically, magnificently wrong. And before this story is over, you will understand exactly how wrong he was, and why that laughter, that single moment of arrogance, helped seal the fate of the entire Nazi war machine. If you've never heard this story the way it truly happened, if you've never felt the full weight of what America actually accomplished between 1940 and 1945, then stay with me, because this is one of the most extraordinary industrial, human, and military stories in the history of warfare. And if you want more stories like this one, ones that don't just recite fact, but make you feel the war the way the people who lived it felt it, then hit subscribe right now. We tell these stories the way they deserve to be told. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to a world on fire. It is 1939, and Europe is collapsing. Germany has invaded Poland. Within weeks, Warsaw is rubble. The Blitzkrieg, that terrifying fusion of tanks, motorized infantry, and overwhelming air power, has proven what many feared and most refused to believe, that a new kind of war had arrived. A war that moved at speed. A war that didn't give defenders time to breathe or think or regroup. A war that the old doctrines, the old tactics, the old generals simply could not answer. By the spring of 1940, the Germans turn west, and what follows is one of the most shocking military campaigns in modern history. France, with its massive army, its famous Maginot Line, its colonial resources and British ally, France falls in 6 weeks. 6 weeks! The British Expeditionary Force barely escapes at Dunkirk, leaving behind their equipment, their vehicles, their pride. The Low Countries are gone. Norway is gone. Denmark is gone. And there, standing at the edge of the English Channel, looking across 21 miles of water at the White Cliffs of Dover, is Adolf Hitler. He controls most of Western Europe. He has the most powerful military force on the continent. And in his mind, in the minds of his generals, in the minds of the entire German High Command, the war is essentially over. There is just one loose end: Britain. Winston Churchill has taken over as Prime Minister in May 1940, replacing the exhausted and politically destroyed Neville Chamberlain. Churchill is 65 years old, overweight, plagued by depression he privately calls his black dog, a man who had spent decades being dismissed, mocked, and marginalized by the British establishment. And yet here he is, defiant, immovable, giving speeches that make grown men weep. We shall fight on the beaches, he tells Parliament. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. These are not just words. Churchill means them. He will burn Britain to the ground before he hands it to Adolf Hitler. But words do not shoot down Messerschmitts. Britain needs aircraft. Britain needs pilots. Britain needs, above all else, time. And across the Atlantic, in a country that had not yet entered the war, that was locked in fierce political debate about whether to enter the war at all, was the only nation on Earth with the industrial potential to provide what Britain needed: America. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to understand what America looked like in 1939 and 1940. This is crucial, because the America that would eventually build 100,000 aircraft per year was not the America that existed when the war began. The America of 1939 was still climbing out of the Great Depression. Unemployment was still high. Factories were operating below capacity. The military was a fraction of its eventual size. The U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world, roughly equivalent to the Army of Romania. 17th! The country had 2,400 combat aircraft. The Luftwaffe had 4 times that number, and they had been flying combat missions for a year. And yet, there was something happening in America, something that Göring couldn't see, or refused to see, or perhaps simply couldn't comprehend because it had no equivalent in Germany. There was a conversation happening, a long, painful, politically explosive conversation about what America's role in this war should be. On one side were the isolationists. These were powerful people, serious people, not simply cowards or appeasers. They genuinely believed that Europe's wars were Europe's problems, that America had paid too high a price in the First World War, that the Atlantic Ocean was protection enough. They had a famous spokesman, Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, a genuine American hero. And Lindbergh was saying loudly and clearly that Germany's air power was invincible, that intervention was hopeless, that America should stay home.
On the other side was Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was one of the most politically gifted human beings ever to hold high office. Struck down by polio in 1921, he had spent years rebuilding himself physically and spiritually, learning how to move through the world from a wheelchair with such effortless dignity that most Americans who saw him on newsreels or heard him on the radio had no real sense of how severe his disability was. He was charming, patient, devious, visionary, a man who saw around corners. And what Roosevelt saw, as early as 1938, was that America could not remain isolated from a world in which Nazi Germany controlled Europe and Imperial Japan controlled Asia. The math simply didn't work. But he was constrained. The American public didn't want war. Congress was deeply skeptical of foreign entanglements, and an election was coming. So Roosevelt did what Roosevelt did. He moved carefully. He moved indirectly. He gave speeches that reassured the public while laying the groundwork for what he knew was inevitable. And in January 1939, 8 months before Hitler invaded Poland, before most of the world understood what was coming, Roosevelt went to Congress and asked for something that stunned the room. He asked for 50,000 military aircraft. Not eventually, per year. The reaction was immediate. Congressional leaders were appalled. Military planners were skeptical. The isolationists smelled manipulation. And across the Atlantic, in the offices of German intelligence, the report made its way up the chain of command until it reached Hermann Göring, who laughed. Let us pause here, because Hermann Göring is a figure worth understanding. Not because he deserves sympathy, he does not, but because understanding him means understanding the particular brand of arrogance that made Nazi Germany's strategic failures so catastrophic. Göring was 50 years old in 1943. He had been a genuine war hero in the First World War, an ace pilot, decorated and celebrated. He was one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party, a man who had stood beside Hitler in the Munich beer hall putsch of 1923 and been shot in the groin for his loyalty. He had survived. He had risen. By 1939, he was the second most powerful man in Germany, Hitler's designated successor, the head of the Luftwaffe, and one of the principal architects of the economic machinery that was feeding the German war effort. He was also, by 1940, increasingly out of touch with reality. He had grown enormously fat on the pleasures of absolute power. He dressed in theatrical uniforms of his own design, covered himself with medals, filled his enormous hunting estate with stolen art from conquered countries. He was addicted to morphine. He gave himself the title Reichsmarschall, a rank that had not existed in the German military since the Napoleonic era, essentially invented so that Göring could hold a rank above all other German field marshals. He believed in German superiority with the absolute certainty of a man who has never been seriously contradicted. And when Göring looked at America, he saw what he wanted to see: a mongrel nation of immigrants, without discipline, without racial unity, without military tradition, a nation of shopkeepers and movie stars and jazz musicians. What could such a country build? What did they know about war? Göring's contempt for American industrial capacity was not an aberration, it was policy. It was the shared assumption of virtually the entire German high command, and it would prove to be the single most expensive miscalculation of the entire war. Because while Göring laughed, America began to move. It started slowly, almost invisibly. In the summer of 1940, as France was falling and Britain was bracing for invasion, Roosevelt asked Congress for emergency defense appropriations. He asked for new aircraft. He asked for new shipyards. He asked for expansion. Congress, shocked by the speed of the German advance across Europe, said yes. But here is what most people don't know. The bureaucratic and industrial machine that would eventually produce 100,000 aircraft per year did not spring into existence overnight. It was assembled, piece by piece, through an almost unbelievable combination of political will, industrial ingenuity, labor mobilization, and sheer American improvisation. And it was assembled by people whose names most of us will never know, in factories and offices and government buildings from Detroit to Seattle to Willow Run, Michigan. Willow Run. The name sounds gentle, almost pastoral, a stretch of water through a willow grove somewhere in the American heartland. And indeed, before 1941, it was more or less exactly that. A stretch of flat farmland in Washtenaw County, Michigan, about 30 miles west of Detroit. By 1943, Willow Run was the largest factory under a single roof in the history of the world. It was Henry Ford who built it. Henry Ford, who himself was a complicated, often monstrous figure, an anti-Semite who had been personally praised by Adolf Hitler, a union buster who had used violent thugs to keep labor organizers off his factory floors. Henry Ford was no hero, but Henry Ford understood mass production with a genius that has rarely been equaled before or since. And when the United States government came to him and said they needed bombers, not cars, not tractors, bombers, Ford saw a problem, and he solved it. The B-24 Liberator was one of the most important heavy bombers of the Second World War. It was a complicated machine, nearly 1 million individual parts, electrically operated systems, hydraulic systems, oxygen systems, gun turrets. It required skilled labor. It required precision. It could not, every military and industrial expert confidently stated, be mass-produced on an assembly line the way Ford built cars. Ford did not believe in things that could not be done. He sent his engineers to the Consolidated Aircraft Factory in San Diego, where B-24s were being built by hand, one at a time, by a workforce of skilled craftsmen. The Consolidated workers were suspicious, even hostile. These Detroit carmen didn't know what they were looking at, they thought. These were aircraft, not automobiles. You couldn't put an airplane on a moving assembly line and stamp it out like a Model T. Ford's engineers watched, they measured, they photographed, they went home to Michigan. And then they built Willow Run. The factory floor was over a mile long. Its main assembly building covered over 3 million square feet. A single moving assembly line, modeled precisely on the Automo lines that had made Ford famous, ran the length of the plant. At one end of the line, workers would begin assembling the wings. By the time those wings reached the other end of the building, a B-24 Liberator would roll out, complete, ready to fly. 1 per hour. That was the target. 1 complete heavy bomber every 60 minutes. Getting there was not easy. The first months at Willow Run were chaos. The initial workforce had no aircraft experience. Parts didn't fit. Systems failed. The Army inspectors who came to evaluate the plant left disgusted, convinced that Ford's boasts were empty. Senator Harry Truman, then heading a committee investigating waste in the defense industry, said publicly that Willow Run was a billion-dollar blunder. But Ford kept going. His engineers modified tools, redesigned parts for easier assembly, invented new techniques on the fly. Workers who had never seen an aircraft in their lives were trained in weeks. Women, thousands of women came to work in the factory as men left for the military. The character of Rosie the Riveter, the cultural icon of women's wartime industrial labor, was not an abstraction. She worked at Willow Run, she worked at Boeing in Seattle, she worked at the Grumman plant in New York and the Douglas Aircraft Factory in California. She worked 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, and she built the Air Force that would break Germany. By 1944, Willow Run was producing a B-24 every 63 minutes. Think about that. Every 63 minutes, around the clock. Every hour while German pilots slept and German generals planned and Hermann Göring moved stolen paintings around his palatial estate, another 4-engine, 100,000-pound heavy bomber rolled off the line in Washtenaw County, Michigan. But Willow Run was only one factory, one single plant. To understand the true scale of what America accomplished, you have to look at the whole picture. Look at Boeing in Seattle. Look at Douglas in Santa Monica. Look at North American aviation in Inglewood, California, where the P-51 Mustang, the plane that would eventually win air superiority over Germany, was designed, refined, and produced at rates that German intelligence simply refused to believe were possible.
Look at the numbers. In 1940, the United States produced 12,804 military aircraft. That was the year Roosevelt made his 50,000 a year speech, the year Göring laughed. In 1941, the year of Pearl Harbor, America produced 26,277 military aircraft. In 1942, the first full year of American participation in the war, the number was 47,836. In 1943, 85,898. In 1944, 96,318. Over the course of the war, the United States produced a total of 324,750 military aircraft. 324,000. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 119,000 aircraft over the entire war, and many of those were produced under the relentless punishment of Allied bombing campaigns, with a workforce increasingly composed of forced laborers who built deliberate flaws into the planes they were forced to assemble. But the aircraft numbers, as staggering as they are, tell only part of the story, because the miracle of American production wasn't just about planes, it was about everything. It was about tanks and jeeps and trucks and artillery shells and landing craft and steel and rubber and oil and ships. The United States built 88,000 tanks during the war, 2.4 million trucks, 6,500 naval vessels, 5,800 merchant ships through the Liberty Ship program alone. The Liberty ships deserve their own moment. In 1941, the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was strangling Britain. Submarines were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Churchill later said that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. If the supply lines across the Atlantic could be cut, Britain would starve. The Soviet Union, attacked by Germany in June 1941, would be unable to receive the material aid it desperately needed. America's answer was the Liberty ship, a cargo vessel roughly 440 feet long, built not by skilled craftsmen in traditional shipyards, but on assembly lines using prefabricated sections welded together. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. By 1943, the average was 42 days. A shipyard in Richmond, California built one in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes as a demonstration of what was possible. 4 days. That was how fast American industry had learned to move. Now let us talk about where all of this production was aimed. Because building 100,000 aircraft is one thing, knowing how to use them, knowing how to forge them into a weapon that could crack the spine of the Third Reich, that is something else entirely. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany is one of the most debated, most controversial, and most important military campaigns of the Second World War. It is also one of the most human. Because the men who flew those missions, the American crewmen in their B-17s and B-24s, the British airmen in their Lancasters, were not abstractions. They were 20-year-old kids from Kansas and Ohio and Alabama who climbed into aluminum tubes at 3 in the morning, flew 8 hours over occupied Europe at 25,000 feet in temperatures of 40 below zero, were shot at by thousands of anti-aircraft guns, attacked by hundreds of German fighter planes, and then, if they survived, climbed back into bed and tried to sleep and tried not to think about the men who hadn't come back. A bomber crew in 1943 was required to complete 25 combat missions before they could be rotated home. 25 missions. The statistical probability of completing 25 missions over Germany in 1943 without being killed or captured was roughly 1 in 4. 1 in 4. The 8th Air Force, the primary American strategic bombing force based in England, suffered more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps in the entire war. Let that settle for a moment. More casualties than the Marines. And yet they kept flying because they had to, because the alternative was to let Germany build and re-equip and reinforce indefinitely, because someone had to go up there. The early years of the bombing campaign were brutal in a way that is difficult to convey. The Americans flew daylight missions, believing that precision bombing was more effective than the British nighttime area bombing strategy. They were right about precision. They were catastrophically wrong about the cost. Flying in daylight meant flying in view of German fighters and flak gunners. In the fall of 1943, on missions deep into Germany, to ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, to aircraft plants at Regensburg, the losses were so severe that the American commanders began to ask whether the campaign could continue. On October 14, 1943, in what history remembers as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses to bomb the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. 60 aircraft were shot down, 600 men killed or captured. Another 121 bombers were damaged in a single afternoon. Generals huddled in offices and did the math, and some of them privately concluded that the campaign, as currently constituted, was not survivable. And here is where the story turns. Here is where the American production miracle and the American technological genius and the American industrial will all converge into a single decisive moment. The problem was escort fighters. The B-17s and B-24s were tough, heavily armed, capable of absorbing enormous punishment, but they could not defend themselves against coordinated attacks of German fighter squadrons. They needed escort fighters. The problem was existing American fighters, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, didn't have the range to accompany bombers all the way to Germany and back. They could go partway. Partway wasn't enough. Someone needed to build a fighter that could go all the way. The P-51 Mustang had been designed in 1940 by North American Aviation in response to a British requirement. In its original form, powered by an Allison engine, it was a capable aircraft, but nothing extraordinary. It had good low-altitude performance and excellent range, but above 15,000 feet the Allison engine struggled. Then a British test pilot named Ronald Harker had a thought. What if you put a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, the engine that won the Battle of Britain, into the Mustang? The combination was, to use the word that everyone who flew the resulting aircraft would reach for eventually, perfect. The Merlin engine transformed the Mustang. Above 20,000 feet where the bombers flew, the P-51 with a Merlin was faster than virtually every German fighter. It was maneuverable, and thanks to its original aerodynamically clean design, it had range that no one quite believed when they first read the specifications. With drop tanks, a P-51 Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back. Berlin and back. The first P-51 Mustangs reached the 8th Air Force in December 1943. By February 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle, who had led the famous Tokyo raid in 1942 and now commanded the 8th Air Force, gave his fighter pilots a new order, an order that changed the war. Until that point, fighter escorts had stayed close to the bombers, protecting them defensively. Doolittle told his pilots to stop doing that. Instead, once the bombers reached the target area, the fighters were to go hunting. Go find German fighters, attack them wherever you find them, attack their airfields, destroy the Luftwaffe. Not just protect the bombers, destroy the Luftwaffe. What followed in February and March of 1944 was what historians call Big Week, a sustained series of massive bombing raids deep into Germany, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs, designed not merely to hit German industrial targets, but to force the Luftwaffe into battle and destroy it there.
The Germans had no choice but to fight. Their factories were being bombed. Their cities were burning. They sent their fighters up in force, and the P-51s were waiting. The attrition of experienced German fighter pilots during Big Week and the months that followed was catastrophic. Germany had superb aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109 were extraordinary machines, and in the hands of experienced pilots, they were a match for almost anything the Allies could put in the air. But experienced pilots take years to produce. You can't put them on an assembly line. You can't stamp them out at Willow Run. Germany had been at war since 1939. Its best pilots, men who had flown in Spain during the Civil War, who had flown over Poland and France and Britain and the Soviet Union, were dying over the Reich, shot down by American pilots flying American aircraft built in American factories by American workers who were working 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, and who had been told that somewhere over Germany tonight, some 20-year-old kid from a small town in Iowa or Georgia was depending on the quality of their work. By the spring of 1944, the numbers were becoming overwhelming, not just in the air, but everywhere. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, supplied by millions of tons of American trucks, food, ammunition, and aircraft under the Lend-Lease program, was pushing the German army back from the staggering depths of the Russian interior. The Germans had reached Stalingrad in the fall of 1942, the farthest point of their advance.
Then the Soviets had encircled them, destroyed the entire German Sixth Army, captured Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the first German field marshal ever to surrender to an enemy, and begun the long, brutal, grinding counteroffensive that would not stop until Soviet soldiers were standing in the ruins of Berlin. In North Africa, the German and Italian forces had been defeated. In Italy, the Allies had landed and were pushing north. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan, and on June 6, 1944, D-Day, 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel and landed on the beaches of Normandy. D-Day could not have happened without air superiority, and air superiority over northern France and the English Channel could not have been achieved without the destruction of the Luftwaffe over Germany in the preceding months. And the destruction of the Luftwaffe could not have happened without the P-51 Mustang, and the P-51 Mustang could not have been produced in the numbers required without the American industrial mobilization. And the American industrial mobilization was rooted ultimately in that moment in 1939 when Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and asked for 50,000 aircraft per year. The moment Hermann Göring laughed at. Look at what that laughter cost. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1939 and 1940, the force that had crushed the Polish and French air forces, that had bombed London and Coventry and Rotterdam, that had provided the critical air cover for the German army's most spectacular victories, that Luftwaffe was effectively broken. Not defeated in some technical or administrative sense, broken. Its experienced pilots were dead. Its fuel supplies were being systematically bombed. Its factories were being systematically bombed. The new pilots being sent to operational units were so undertrained, sometimes with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, that they were dying in accidents as often in combat. In September 1944, American P-51s flew an escort mission to Berlin. After the bombers had dropped their loads and turned for home, some of the fighter pilots descended to rooftop level and strafed the streets of Berlin with their machine guns. The streets of Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, the city that Hitler had intended to rename Germania and rebuild as the architectural showpiece of a 1,000-year empire. American fighter pilots were shooting up its streets. Hermann Göring was somewhere in Berlin on that day, somewhere behind thick walls, surrounded by art he had stolen from the museums of occupied Europe, perhaps still able to hear the sound of Merlin engines overhead. There is no record of whether he laughed. But let us go back to something. Let us go back to those workers, because in the story of how America built its Air Force, it is too easy to drown in statistics and lose sight of the human beings who made those statistics possible. 100,000 aircraft per year is a number. Behind that number are names. There is a woman from Harlan County, Kentucky, who had never been more than 50 miles from home before the war, who answered a newspaper advertisement for factory work, took a train to Ypsilanti, Michigan, and spent 3 years riveting aluminum skins onto B-24 fuselages at Willow Run. She was 22 years old. She worked the night shift. She sent money home to her mother. She became, in the language of the era, an expert at her job, and the foreman used to bring visitors from the Army Air Forces to watch her work. There are black men from Chicago's South Side, workers in a country where the military was still segregated and where the defense industry was still, in many places, telling black workers they need not apply. They fought for their jobs, they organized, they worked, and they built planes that were flown by men who would not have been allowed to sit next to them on a bus. These are not stories that end up in official histories. They are the texture of the war, the human fabric beneath the numbers. And then there are the pilots. There is a man named Chuck Yeager, not yet famous, not yet the man who would break the sound barrier, just a 21-year-old kid from Hamlin, West Virginia, a natural flyer, with eyes so sharp his fellow pilots swore he could see German fighters before any instrument could detect them. He is flying P-51s over Germany in the fall of 1944.
He has already been shot down over France, already evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, already managed, against all regulations, to talk himself back into combat. On October 12, 1944, Chuck Yeager shoots down 5 German aircraft in one engagement, in one flight. He becomes an ace in one day. He doesn't talk about it much afterwards. He doesn't think of himself as a hero. He thinks of himself as a pilot, doing a job. That is the American soldier, not the recruiting poster, not the propaganda newsreel, just a young man doing a difficult, terrifying, necessary job, and doing it well enough to help end the war. And then there are the Tuskegee Airmen, the black pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, men who had to fight the United States Army for the right to fly before they could fight the Luftwaffe, men who flew in a segregated air force, who ate in segregated mess halls, who were told by official policy that they were inferior, and who flew some of the longest escort missions of the war, protecting bombers deep into Germany and Austria, and whose white counterparts eventually began specifically requesting them as escorts because of their legendary reputation for protecting their charges. One of those men was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the first black general in American history, a man who had been given the silent treatment, not spoken to by a single fellow cadet for 4 years at West Point, and who had survived that particular cruelty and come out the other side with a discipline and dignity that commanded respect from everyone who ever served under him. Davis led the 332nd on a mission to bomb an oil refinery in Ploiești, Romania, a target so heavily defended it was nicknamed Flak City. He brought his men home. These are the people who built and flew the aircraft that Hermann Göring laughed at. Now, let us talk about Göring at the end.
Because there is something almost Shakespearean about the arc of his war. He begins it as the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the commander of the greatest air force in Europe, the man who confidently promises Adolf Hitler that the Luftwaffe can destroy the British Royal Air Force, can prevent British evacuation at Dunkirk, can supply the encircled German Sixth Army at Stalingrad by air. He fails at all of it. The Battle of Britain, which he personally commands in the summer and fall of 1940, is the Luftwaffe's first defeat. The British, outnumbered and under enormous strain, hold on by their fingernails. The Hurricanes and Spitfires of the Royal Air Force, combined with the radar network that provides advance warning and the extraordinary courage of pilots who fly 4 and 5 sorties a day from grass airfields in southern England, together they deny Germany the air superiority that a channel crossing would require. Hitler cancels the invasion. Then Göring swears the Luftwaffe can supply the encircled German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. His transport aircraft can carry the required tonnage, he tells Hitler. Hitler believes him. The Sixth Army holds its positions, waiting for air supply that never arrives in sufficient quantities. 300,000 German soldiers, the cream of the German army, are captured or killed. It is the turning point of the Eastern Front. As the war turns against Germany, as the bombers come in greater and greater numbers, as the P-51s appear over Berlin, as one German city after another is reduced to rubble, Göring retreats further and further into denial. He retreats to his art-filled estate. He retreats into morphine. He tells Hitler that the next generation of German jets will change everything. He tells Hitler that the Americans cannot maintain their production rates. He tells Hitler things that Adolf Hitler desperately wants to hear and that bear increasingly little relationship to reality. Hitler, in the end, strips him of all his positions. In April 1945, as Soviet forces close in on Berlin, Göring sends Hitler a telegram suggesting that if Hitler is unable to continue leading the Reich, perhaps Göring should assume command. Hitler, consumed by rage and paranoia in the bunker, reads this as a coup attempt. He orders Göring arrested for treason. Hermann Göring is captured by American forces in May 1945. He sits in the dock at Nuremberg, no longer fat,
Allied captivity has stripped him of his drug supply and most of his excess weight, and he is, in a strange and terrible way, still impressive. He still has that commanding presence, that facility for argument and theater. He cross-examines witnesses with skill. He makes speeches that impress some observers with their coherence, even as they horrify everyone with their moral vacancy. He shows no remorse. He argues to the end that he had served his country. He is sentenced to death. He cheats the hangman by biting down on a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. How he obtained it, where he hid it, is still not definitively known. Göring the showman, Göring the survivor, Göring the man who had always found a way to turn a situation to his advantage, he managed, in the end, one last escape. But history does not escape. History keeps the account. And the account is clear. The man who laughed at 50,000 aircraft watched America build 324,000. The man who told Hitler the Luftwaffe was invincible watched it be systematically dismantled over the skies of Germany by pilots flying aircraft that should not, by his reckoning, have existed. The man who bet Germany's air supremacy on the assumption that American industrial capacity was a fantasy watched that fantasy produce the largest air force in the history of warfare. He was wrong about all of it. But here is the thing that history often forgets to say clearly enough. Germany was not defeated by abstractions. It was not defeated by numbers on a production spreadsheet. It was defeated by human beings, by the workers in Willow Run who built a bomber every 63 minutes, by the engineers at North American Aviation who decided to put a Merlin engine in a Mustang, by the fighter pilots who flew 10 hours in freezing cold and came back to do it again the next day, by the bomber crews who flew their 25th mission knowing the statistical odds had always said they wouldn't survive to fly it, by the Tuskegee airmen who fought for the right to fight and then fought superbly, by the women who picked up riveters and welding torches and learned to do in weeks what craftsmen spent years mastering, by a country that when asked to produce 50,000 aircraft, produced 100,000. There is something worth sitting with in that. Because the United States in 1940 was not a country that had everything figured out. It was a country in the middle of argument and contradiction and inequality and political division. It was a country where the Tuskegee Airmen had to demand the right to serve, where women factory workers went home to societies that still expected them to be defined by their domestic roles, where Congress debated and newspapers argued, and isolationists and interventionists shouted at each other across the front pages. And yet, in the face of a genuine existential threat, this imperfect, argumentative, contradictory country mobilized with a speed and scale and effectiveness that had no precedent in human history. It did not do so perfectly. There were scandals and waste and discrimination and tragedy. But it did it. It actually did it. And 25-year-old workers in Michigan and California and New York who had grown up in the Depression, who had never had money or security or certainty, found themselves part of something so much larger than themselves that it was almost impossible to comprehend. They were building the machines that would end the war. They knew it, they felt it, and they came in the next day and built more. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. Bell chimes rang in London. People danced in the streets of Paris, streets that had been occupied by German soldiers for 4 years. In Moscow, they fired artillery in celebration. In New York, sailors kissed strangers in Times Square. In Hamlin, West Virginia, Chuck Yeager's parents got a telegram that said their son was coming home. In the ruins of Berlin, people dug through rubble for food and water. In an American military prison, Hermann Göring sat in a cell and prepared his defense for the tribunal that would judge him. And in Washtenaw County, Michigan, at the enormous plant beside the river, the assembly lines slowed and then stopped for the first time since 1942. Workers set down their tools. They looked at each other. Some of them had been here from the beginning, from the early chaotic days when nothing worked and the Army inspectors shook their heads and Senator Truman called it a billion-dollar blunder. Now they were standing in the factory that had helped win the war. The last B-24 had rolled off the line.
Something quieter, something that the history books rarely make room for. There is the knowledge that ordinary people, when history calls on them, are capable of extraordinary things. That the workers who built those planes were not special in the way we usually mean special. They were not geniuses or heroes before the war found them. They were workers and farmers and shopkeepers and students. They were young and scared and uncertain, and they had doubts about whether any of it would work. And they built the Air Force that ended the Third Reich. There's a P-51 Mustang on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It is a beautiful machine, clean and aggressive, all curves and purpose. There is a small card beside it that lists its statistics: range, speed, ceiling, armament. It does not list the name of the worker in Inglewood, California, who riveted a particular panel onto the airframe. It does not list the name of the woman who torqued a particular bolt to the correct specification. Those names are mostly lost, but the airplane is there. The airplane is real, and the airplane is evidence, not of American perfection, but of American possibility, of what becomes possible when the challenge is great enough and the will is sufficient. Hermann Göring looked at a photograph of a half-built factory in the American Midwest, and he saw weakness. He saw a culture that could not organize, could not sacrifice, could not produce. He saw, in short, a mirror image of what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. What was actually there was Willow Run. What was actually there was Chuck Yeager. What was actually there was Benjamin Davis and the Tuskegee Airmen. What was actually there was a woman from Kentucky and a man from Chicago's South Side, and a million others whose names history has forgotten, but whose work history cannot erase. 324,000 aircraft. Hermann Göring laughed. America built 100,000 planes a year. And the world, for all its continued complications and contradictions, is different because of it. Take a moment today. Think about those assembly lines. Think about those pilots climbing into their cockpits at 3 in the morning. Think about what it costs to do something that necessary, that large, that well. And if this story moved you, if these untold corners of the Second World War are the kind of history you want to carry with you, then like this video, leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest, and subscribe. Every week, we go looking for the stories that the textbooks pass over, the moments that history almost forgot, the human beings behind the numbers and the dates and the battles. Because history isn't an abstraction, it is people. It is always people, and those people deserve to be remembered.